Most important concept after the standard deviation which you need to learn is the coefficient of variation. What is this coefficient of variation? In case of standard deviation, we have tried to calculate how much values are varying or dispersed. After that, remember, standard deviation is the absolute measure of your dispersion. The relative measure of your standard deviation is coefficient of variation. This is represented as CV symbolically. And again, this was the tool which was developed by Carl Pearson. This is the relative measure of standard deviation. Standard deviation is the absolute measure, and your coefficient of variation is the relative measure of standard deviation. Now, what is coefficient of variation? Coefficient of variation is defined as the percentage of standard deviation to the mean. That is, it is calculated like this: CV equals standard deviation divided by mean into 100. Nothing but standard deviation will tell us the scatteredness of the data. Mean will tell us the uh, average value of the data, and from the average value how much values are dispersed is expressed in case of percentage, which is your coefficient of variation. It shows the relationship between standard deviation and mean, which is expressed in form of percentage. Nothing but it shows the extent of variability in relation to the mean of the population in percentage. This is very useful for comparison of two or more series to find out which is more consistent, which is more variable, which is more uniform, etc. Whenever you calculate your CV, if values of CV is greater, it means that it is more variable. It is less consistent, less uniform, less stable, less homogeneous. If CV is lesser, that means values are more homogeneous, more uniform, therefore more consistent. This is how two sets of data are compared when a coefficient of variation is used to find out the measure of dispersion in two sets of data series. So, coefficient of variation, standard deviation is an absolute measure of dispersion. The corresponding relative measure is known as coefficient of variation. It is given as standard deviation divided by mean into 100. Coefficient of variation is defined as the percentage of the standard deviation to the mean. It is useful It is a relative measure of dispersion, useful in making comparison between two sets of the data to know the degree of variability. The higher the CV, the greater will be the dispersion. I hope you have followed it very clearly. Let's go to one of the examples.